this lecture is associated with the exhibition that opened at the gallery just 10 days ago, Most Loved Works in the Stanley Spencer Gallery. And for those of you who contributed your suggestions, I'm heartily grateful, because really this is an exhibition that would not have happened without the input of many people associated with the gallery and many volunteers. And so the original conceit of it was to do an exhibition based around the works in our collection, and I asked people who were involved in the gallery to nominate what were their favourite works and what were the ones that they loved the most. And that's why we have now what you might call a kind of all-star exhibition on the walls of the Stanley Spencer Gallery. So the talk that I'm going to give this evening is based around many of the works that are on display, but I want to bring it back to the relationship between Spencer and Cookham, which I'm sure is a subject, both Spencer and Cookham, that many of you know a lot about. But I want to explore in a bit more detail what exactly Cookham meant to Spencer and why it recurs so often in his paintings. And we'll look at some of the works in the exhibition along the way, and we'll look at a few works that aren't in the exhibition. But no matter how much you know about Spencer and about Cookham, I hope there will be something new in this for everybody. So there are very few artists that I think are as closely connected with one place as Stanley Spencer and Cookham. He was born here, he lived the greater part of his life here. He did move to London for a while. He was in Berkeley while he was painting the chapel, but he came back again and again, and then he spent the last 10 years of his life here. He died in the War Memorial Hospital at Clifton, and in fact his ashes are buried in the churchyard, just a few meters from where we are now. And it was his student nickname. When he was studying at the Slade, he came back to Cookham every night because he loved it so much, and so his fellow students gave him the nickname Cookham, which he quite liked. When he was writing to Jacques and Gwen Ravarat, his friends, he would actually sign his letters off Cookham. And so many of his paintings are set in Cookham. And yes, you might expect that from an artist, that they would set landscape paintings in the place where they lived and that they love. But for Spencer, it's not just his landscape. So many of his imaginative paintings, even though they are of events and situations that are constructed from his mind, from his imagination, they are very clearly set in recognizable Cookham locations populated by the Cookham villagers. And so here is an absolute classic of the genre, The Resurrection Cookham. And again, this is situated just a few meters from here, but it is obviously, this is not what you would call a landscape painting. Yes, there is the church, there is the churchyard, there is a slice of the river that you can recognize, but obviously the events that are going on here are created from Spencer's imagination, even if many of the characters in it are real people. So Spencer himself, his brother-in-law Richard Carline, this is Henry Slessor, his wife Hilda appears in several instances. That's her climbing over the stile at the back. So Cookham is in his imagination as well as in his landscape paintings. So the people, was there ever really a village that was immortalized really in painting as Cookham is in Spencer's paintings? So I want to use this talk to try to understand a little bit more about why it was so important to him and what exactly was it that he was trying to achieve by putting Cookham in his paintings again and again. So we're going to get a little bit Freudian now, and we're going to put Spencer on the psychiatrist's couch, metaphorically speaking, and begin with his childhood, because I think the very happy childhood that he had and his family upbringing and his early years in Cookham were of fundamental importance to his art for the rest of his life. So here he is with the Spencer family. He was the second youngest of 9 siblings. So this is Ma and Pa here, and this is Stanley and his younger brother Gilbert, and I won't name them all, but he was part of a very large and lively family, and they really contributed a lot to his intellectual development. they would sit around the kitchen table and discuss literature and politics. They were an immensely musical family. Pa was the organist that heads the church, but his brothers were also very talented musicians. Stanley himself was a very accomplished piano player. So culture played a very big part in their family life, although not actually visual arts. They had a few prints on the walls, but they were not an artistic family in the visual arts sense, and that is something that Stanley and Gilbert were the first to bring into the family. But it wasn't just about the family, it was also about the wider community of Cookham. And I'm sure you know exactly where this is. Again, it's very close to where we are, and of course the gallery is just here in the old Methodist church. And so the people and the experiences that Spencer had in his childhood were feeding into a bank of memories that he would then go on to draw on from the rest of his life. And I think he was unusually sensitive and alive to the small details of life. And he really thought like a poet. So I'd like to read to you a small section from this letter. Don't worry, I'm not expecting you to be able to read his handwriting, although I have to say, actually, compared to some of his other writings, this one's quite legible. But I have transcribed it for you. And this is from a long letter that he wrote to his friend Desmond Shute in March 1917. So where he was in March 1917 was in Salonika at war. And so perhaps it was not unusual that he should be particularly nostalgic about Cookham, but he wrote a very long letter to Shute in which he described an idealized day in Cookham. And I could have picked actually pretty much any section from the letter because the whole of it is very, very lyrical. It's beautifully written, but I'm just going to read you a short section, which is the section we have here starting at the top. It's now got to the evening of the day. He's described everything he's done so far. He says, I have a good gossip with Mama and anyone good enough to give me some gossip. Then I go out and walk up to Annie Slack's shop and sit in the shop and watch the customers. After the great doings of the night and the shops closed, I just have one deliberate walk round by the Crown Hotel, down the Berries and along the footpath to the riverside, then along by the river through Bellrope Meadow to the Leatherbridge's garden end of meadow, and then I stand still and the river moves on in a solid mass, not a ripple. So it's almost like poetry, I think, but it's also very specific. He names the places, he names Berries, he names the Crown Hotel, he names Bellrope Meadow, and all of these places are, as I said, they're kind of going into a bank of memories that he will draw on. So it's very much specifically about Cookham, but I think that the way he writes about it is, it's quite mystical, really. It's almost like an incantation. It's not like a letter that you would just write, a newsy letter to a friend. He's really thinking about Cookham here in a very spiritual way. And so very early on, Cookham begins to appear in his paintings. Even before he goes to war, Cookham is in his paintings. So of course he draws the people and the places around him, and we do have some paintings and drawings in the gallery that are in the exhibition that are really just that, just a representation of what's around him. So one very charming little drawing of young Roy Lacey in Holy Trinity Church, which is in the current exhibition. It's a beautiful drawing. There probably isn't more to it beyond what you see. It's just a lovely drawing of Roy. But he also has these imaginative paintings that are very layered with meaning, and that starts early on before the war. And this is really one of his earliest paintings, John Donne Entering Heaven, painted in 1911. And this is one of his earliest paintings in which he brings out his Cookham memories and starts to paint works that have more of a spiritual meaning. Now, I don't know if you have read Kenneth Popel's biography of Spencer, but he's particularly good at kind of digging into what's going on in Spencer's mind when he's painting these works. And he talks about how John Donne's sermons were really pivotal at this point. In fact, it was Gwen and John Raverat who had lent Spencer a book on John Donne, and he really took it to heart. And by looking at the way that John Donne wrote and thought about heaven, Spencer made that connection with John Donne's feelings to his own feelings about Cookham. So Donne talked about the eternal joy that he felt in heaven. Spencer felt eternal joy in Cookham. So if he feels eternal joy in Cookham, then Cookham must be holy. Cookham must be spiritual. So he begins to make that connection. And this painting, which is of multiple John Donnes entering heaven on Woodbrook Common, is his attempt to explain and express his heavenly feelings that he has about Cookham. Now, it's not a literal representation of heaven, and it's not even a literal representation of Woodbrook Common, because there are aspects of it that are quite recognisable, that vista of fields, but I'm sure you'll be familiar with the Common, and there are no cliffy bits like that on the Common. It is completely flat. There are a few ditches, but there are not any cliffs like that. And what that is actually a section of riverbank elsewhere in Cookham. So he has taken different bits of Cookham and he's brought them together in a single location. It's a collage, essentially. And it's a collage not only of the actual places, but of the feelings that he associated with those places. So he had what were called place feelings, or Kenneth Popel calls them memory feelings, and that they are signposts to the feelings that they engendered in Spencer. So by putting them together in the painting, he's trying to recapture the feelings that he associates with those particular places. And the Apple Gatherers. This is another of his early works. And I was really pleased. Very recently, I went to Tate, who have just done a big rehang of the galleries that they call a walk through British art, which is essentially the free galleries of their permanent collection. And this is now out on display. And as far as I know, it's not been out on display for a really long time. So I was thrilled to see that this is one that they've chosen to put out. And you would not think, to look at this, that this is a Cookham painting. But it absolutely is a Cookham painting in Spencer's mind. And it's a way for him to capture the place feelings. It was painted in Cookham. He began it at Fernley, his family home, and then he moved out to use the space in the empty ship inn at the top of Mill Lane because he had a bit more space and a bit more quiet. Now, I was delighted that Tate have got that out. I wasn't so pleased with their caption because their caption actually didn't talk about Cookham and suggested that it's inspired by orchards in Somerset when he was staying with Henry Lamb. But actually, Spencer said elsewhere that very specifically that this is about the mill stream and this is about Saxe Meadow, and it's about being taken out in Miss Llewellyn's punt. So it's not even about a place, it's about a memory that he had. But in the process of painting this, he's trying to capture the feeling that he had when he was out in Miss Llewellyn's punt and instill that into the painting. And in fact, the orchard is probably one behind Fernley. So it is a real Cookham place, but he didn't want to represent the orchard. He wanted to represent the feeling of being in the punt on the mill stream. And in fact, in his own words, he said, "I wanted the persons in the picture to continue to, without interruption, what the place had begun in my mind, and for them to be the material outcome of the place." So this is emphatically not a landscape painting. And when it came to landscape paintings, he had very different feelings about that. The first landscape he ever did was of Cockmarsh. His father had asked him to do a landscape, thought it might be a useful genre for him to take up. And he went out and he painted Cockmarsh and he came back and he said, "Well, I felt that what I was doing had no connection with anything I felt at all. I feared it might destroy the special feelings I had for that place." So it wasn't that he didn't have special feelings for Cockmarsh, but the act of just mechanically taking down the view and putting it on canvas bypassed all of those feelings that he has put into Apple Gatherers here. So there's Cookham, the place, in a painting, but it's Cookham feelings that he's trying to capture rather than the visual landscape of Cookham, although I'm going to complicate that slightly a bit later. Yeah. So, not Spencer. Oh. And the reason why I've put this in is because I kind of wanted to give it a little bit of context in the works that he was instilled in, and perhaps dig a little bit into the way that his mind was working. So he was very formally trained in art history. He attended Roger Fry's art history lectures at the Slade, and Spencer also went to the National Gallery a lot, and he was very familiar with the works of the early Renaissance, both the Italian Renaissance but also the Northern Renaissance, like the works of Petrus Christus here. And the reason why I put this in is because I wanted to show you how the idea of setting biblical events in a contemporary landscape or interior with contemporary characters is something that Spencer shares with his Renaissance predecessors. And so we have the Annunciation taking place here in a setting that is absolutely 15th century Netherlandish interior. You know, that furniture was completely up to date. The clothing, it's completely up to date. This is a real, it feels like it could be a real place. You could populate that with ordinary characters going about their everyday business, but what we actually have is Gabriel and Mary and the act of the Annunciation taking place. So we think of Spencer, and I'm going to come on to his religious paintings in a minute, we think of them as being quite modern and quite radical by setting biblical events in 20th century Cookham, but actually he's just following a precedent that has been set by early Renaissance painters. And he had done this before the war with works like Zacharias and Elizabeth, but when Spencer came back from the war, even though he, like many young men, had had a traumatic experience and he felt that that whole pre-war innocence had been lost, nevertheless, when he came back, I think the 20s were probably his most fertile decade in terms of his imagination and producing some really great works. And what he comes on to paint in the very early years after coming back is a series of religious paintings, many of which are set in Cookham. So now the Betrayal actually isn't in our current exhibition because it was in Delight in Nature, so you may have seen it, but you may have seen it recently, but I wanted to bring this in because it's one of his first post-war biblical paintings where he takes a biblical narrative and he sets it in a very recognizable Cookham location. So what we have here is the moment at which, just after Jesus has been betrayed with a kiss and the servant of the high priest steps in to arrest him in the Garden of Gethsemane, and then we see the disciples up here peering over the wall at the back. But he didn't set it in Gethsemane, he set it in the Garden of Fernley, his family home, and this wall here is the garden wall at the end of the wall, and then this building here with the conical roof is the malt houses that were behind, and then these green sections here that look like arms, we know from a labelled sketch that they're actually the yew tree that was in the garden of his family home, and he described the feeling that the tree gave him. He said, "This tree has many apertures, opening, etc., which greatly excites my imagination. They all seem holy and secret." And I think that's one of the keys to understanding why he did this, why he took this great biblical scene and set it in the garden of his family home, because it was those feelings that he had from his home, from the yew tree, from looking out at the malt houses behind, that it gave him holy feelings. So when he wanted to paint a biblical scene and create the holiness of the scene, the best way he felt he could do that was by tapping into what made him feel holy, what made him feel special. And I think one of the kind of paradoxes of Spencer's art is that it is incredibly personal, because you sort of have to understand what's going on in his mind and what those references are to get what he's doing, and he's really just painting for himself. And yet, the popularity of his works and his enduring reputation as one of the great painters one of the great British painters of the 20th century suggests that even though it's incredibly personal, he has managed to transcend that individual personal vision, and everybody, or many people, are able to recognize those holy and secret feelings, or the redemption, or whatever it is that he's putting in. It somehow seems to resonate out beyond himself, even though it's incredibly individual. And so we come on to The Last Supper. Now, The Last Supper is in most loved works, and I'm really thrilled that it's out, because it's the first time that I have seen it out of store since I've been associated with the gallery. And it's another painting that is very, very closely connected with Cookham. So just to give you a little bit of context about its creation, in early 1920, Spencer was invited to go and work and then live with Sir Henry and Margaret Slessor, who lived just across the river in Bourne End in a house called Cornerways, which I haven't managed to locate, but if you know where it is, let me know. I think it's on that road where when you go over the bridge, it's the sort of private road that goes around and they're on the river, because I know they had a big house and they were right on the river. Anyway, away from Fernley, which was happy but very busy, and I imagine also very noisy, he had the space to work, and he had an incredibly productive 18 months whilst he was with the Slessors. And this is one of the first paintings that he made while he was there. The Slessors were Catholics, and I think that may have partly inspired this work. But he was also thinking about biblical themes a lot anyway, because Spencer was a regular and avid Bible reader. And so he painted this painting of The Last Supper, which he set in the malt houses, as I mentioned before, just behind Fernley, his family home. The wall that we see up here is the wall of the grain bin. These are grain sacks that the disciples are using as pillows. And again, the malt houses had a holy and a special feeling for Spencer, because he wasn't allowed into them as a child. He wasn't allowed to go and play in them. And I think we all know that if there's somewhere that's forbidden, that immediately that's quite exciting. And so he painted The Last Supper, but in the summer of 1920, but he'd been thinking about it since at least May 1915, because he wrote to his friends, the Raverats. He said, "I have a great idea about The Last Supper. I feel sure it's good, but I want to be certain." So by the time he came to paint it, that was 5 years in the gestation. Now, of course, the war had happened in between, but even while he was away at war, whilst he was working in the Beaufort Memorial Hospital, he was still thinking about this painting. He had a friend, Jack Witchell, who also worked as an orderly at Beaufort, and Jack said, as he handles food or laundry, his thoughts are actually engaged on biblical subjects, such as the Last Supper. So I think he was mulling this over all of the time that he was scrubbing floors and washing lockers and carrying trays. And for me, that really shows in this, because having spent a long time looking at this painting, I really think it's a masterpiece of composition. And I'm just going to kind of talk you through some of the observations that I've made, but I'm sure you will have other observations too. So if you look at the way that he has composed this, it's incredibly symmetrical and balanced. And then he uses that symmetry very cleverly by, when he breaks the point of symmetry, he creates moments of drama. So to show you what I mean, you could draw a line that goes down the middle here. And what's going on the left and what's going on the right are mirroring each other, obviously with some differences, but you have 4 disciples on each side. These ones here reach out their arms while they reach back, so it's almost like a movement going on there. You've got these toes that are in pairs, but if you look at the shadows in the folds, they're like mirror images of each other, with the dark folds going into the light and the light folds going into the dark. Even when it comes down to things like facial hair, notice that there are only 3 men with beards, Jesus in the middle, and these two disciples here. So again, completely symmetrical. And then the big moment of drama that's going on is that we have the disciple here, Simon, leaning over onto his breast, and then this is Judas, who cringes away, and I think it's almost as though he's covering his mouth to forestall the kiss of betrayal. So it's a very, very clever and very well thought through composition. It looks incredibly simple at first glance, but it's actually extremely sophisticated. So when it was finished, Henry Slessor, there was some talk of the Contemporary Art Society purchasing it, but Slessor didn't want it to leave the house. He loved it so much. And so he purchased it for £150. And he had, rather unusually, I mentioned he was a Catholic, he had a private oratory, which was in the loft of his boathouse. And so it hung there. Sounds like a little bit of a flood risk to me, but at least it was on the first floor. And so it hung in the boathouse. And so Spencer then was very grateful to the Slessors. He really enjoyed staying with them, and as I said, it was a very, very productive period. And so he painted them a triptych as a gift to express his gratitude to them. And so these two paintings, which again are in the current exhibition, we have on the left St. Veronica unmasking Christ, and on the right Christ overturning the money changers table, and I'm going to show you the central one in a minute. These are illustrating the Bible verse John 2:15, and when he'd made a scourge of small cords, he drove them all out of the temple and the sheep and the oxen and poured out the changers' money and overthrew the tables. Now obviously that's not St. Veronica, this is the one on the right. St. Veronica, he later admitted, was in there purely for compositional purposes. So having done this lovely painting of Christ overturning the table, he thought, what would balance that? Again, we're thinking about symmetry here. Oh, St. Veronica unmasking Christ. But again, he's very cleverly, he's reversed the colorways here. So we have the white robe and the red table and the red robe and the white sheet and white Christ. And so they balance very nicely and turn in towards each other. Now, I'm not totally sure where this is. You might be able to recognize it, but I imagine those buildings are somewhere in Cookham as well. And then just to show you, this was the central part of the triptych, which unfortunately we don't own. This is in the Art Gallery of Western Australia. But this is what it would have looked like to have them together as a triptych. And so in the current exhibition, we have hung them with the Last Supper in the center to evoke the original arrangement of the triptych. And because the Last Supper was, although painted, just a few months before, they are all closely associated. And Spencer hoped that they would be hung in the oratory, but I think the central one did not hang in the oratory. I imagine there probably wasn't that much space for it, because actually, if I go back, you'll see it's pretty enormous, so you need quite a lot of room for that. Okay, so Sarah Tubb. This is a fun one to explain. Sarah Tubb is absolutely classic Spencer religious painting set in Cookham, that there is so much more going on to it than meets the eye as well. So just briefly to explain the story of Sarah Tubb and the Heavenly Visitors, I'm not sure I even can do this briefly because it's so complicated. For a start, it's not just one Sarah Tubb. Sarah Tubb was the daughter of Sally Tubb. Sally Tubb lived in Cookham in the 19th century, and Spencer's father recounted a story to him in which Halley's Comet and the tail of Halley's Comet had created such a vivid sunset that old Sally Tubb thought the end of the world was nigh, and she ran out and dropped to her knees in the high street and began to pray. And so Spencer has painted her in this episode, comforted by angels or heavenly visitors. And then I said it was complicated because actually the features are not Sarah Tubb, because Sarah Tubb lived before Spencer was born and he didn't know her. So the features are of, Sally Tubb lived before he was born. The features are of Sarah Tubb, her daughter, who was an old lady when Spencer was a child. So he remembered Sarah Tubb, but I think he's used this photo. This is a photo of Sarah Tubb. If you look at what she's wearing, it looks very much like the same to me, particularly that bonnet that she's wearing. And so it's actually a conflation of two different women and a story that was recounted to him. So far, so good. But when you come to Spencer's own explanation of what's going on here, it's almost something completely different. So Sarah Tubb was painted in 1936. The next year, he wrote in his notebook an explanation of what this painting is about. And I'm just going to read you the opening lines, and you'll see how he describes this painting. He said, when you are married and you have been in bed with your wife, do you not feel an emotion of blessedness when you catch sight of her next day somewhere in the street or some shop? Does not the fact that your naked bodies were together during the night add to her dressed and coated and hatted self now? Okay, so that is his opening about Sarah Tubb. Okay. And then he comes on, he describes the incident, and he says, well, the incident, in other words, Sarah Tubb, or Sally Tubb, falling to her knees, the incident only interests me from the particular point of view in the fact that I'm able to get a clear vision of what I keep seeing and wanting to express. I'm filled with a longing and a crucial need to express something I feel about that woman and place. It's a glorification of that old woman. It's making love to Sarah Tubb through a sort of religious fervour. So what he's actually trying to say in this is that his memories of old Sally Tubb and Cookham fill him with such religious fervour that he has sexual feelings about her, but that's because in his mind, sex and religion are also conflated. And I think that goes back to his discovery of sex with his first wife, Hilda Carline. And so when he wants to express great religious feeling or great love, he does that in sexual terms. So he's not saying that he is sexually attracted to Sarah Tubb. What he's saying is that the feelings, that his memories of her as an old woman and of the Cookham stories, the feelings that they invoke, he needs to express in sexual terms, because to him, love and sex and religion are all part and parcel of the same thing. So, I mean, he's just the gift that keeps on giving. And so this comes out in some of his other paintings, that when you look at them, you think, what on earth is going on here? And I've put this one in because this is one of the more conservative ones, A Village in Heaven. But there's also Love on the Moor, Love Among the Nations, Adoration of Old Men. And you look at them and you just think, what on earth? But when you dig into Spencer's feelings about love and religion and sex and Cookham that are all bound up in each other, you can see what it is that he's trying to express. And I especially love this detail here of this little boy that could possibly be Spencer himself, I'm not sure, but he is worshipping a tree root. And that feeling of adoration that he is giving to the tree root, it's like his love for Cookham and the sense of place is so deep that he wants to absolutely worship the physicality of it. So there's a kind of polyamorous element to his religious feelings and his feelings about Cookham. So just getting back on slightly safer ground now. In The Marriage at Cana, it's a biblical story in which Jesus is celebrating with the guests, and it was often interpreted as being Jesus's approval of earthly celebration and approval of marriage and joy. And so this was something that Spencer could really embrace. And so he painted a number of paintings along the theme of The Marriage at Cana that were intended for the church house. Now, I will just give a quick recap of the church house for any of you who are not familiar with it. After Spencer had painted the chapel at Buccleuch, the Sandon Memorial Chapel, with his series of war paintings, he was so delighted with that he hoped he would have another opportunity to paint a complete cycle of works in a dedicated location. Only this time, instead of the war, it was going to be his entire life and all of his loves and the significant women in his life, and they would form the material for it. It was enormously ambitious because in his mind, it was going to be virtually the size of Cookham. The nave was going to extend the length of the high street. The transepts were the road to Maidenhead and to Bourne End. I think the choir was Odney Common. I'm not entirely sure where he thought it was going to be built, because quite a lot of Cookham would have had to be demolished to actually build it, which would seem to be missing the point. I think in his mind, he thought it was a wonderful project. I think he didn't really ever believe it would happen. And his dealer, Dudley Tooth, is marvellously diplomatic. And after Spencer's given one of these sort of great explanations of how wonderful it would be, Dudley wrote in this very diplomatic letter in which he said, "Well, of course, if I hear of any big commissions, I will let you know. But in the meantime, I suggest you just paint some individual paintings that we can sell." So even after he knew it would never be built, Spencer conceived of many of his paintings as having a particular place because he liked his works to all be part of a bigger scheme. And there were going to be side chapels dedicated to individual women in his life, but the Marriage at Cana series were also going to be in the church house. Actually, as was Sarah Tubb, she was going in the church house as well. And so Spencer being Spencer, the Marriage at Cana, of course, was taking place in Cookham. And the bride and groom were going to be Stanley Spencer and his first wife, Hilda Carline. But they also appear in other paintings like this one as wedding guests. So here again, we have Stanley as one of the guests underneath, and Hilda, and they are choosing clothes that they are going to wear to the wedding at Cana, the marriage, as guests. But almost certainly, this is a real chest of drawers from his home that he actually described in a letter to Hilda. And we can be certain that even though we see only a small section of the room, this room is in a house in Cookham. So again, it's all in Cookham in his mind. And it's rather poignant, actually, that he was painting this 1936. You may know from the chronology of his life, this is just before his marriage to Hilda fell apart. So even as his marriage is falling apart, he is painting these paintings celebrating not only marriage as an institution, but specifically painting a marriage in which he and his wife, soon to be ex-wife, are the bride and groom. And then two other paintings that are from the Marriage at Cana series that are in the current exhibition are from a subset of that series because, gosh, his imagination was exhaustive. So it wasn't enough to just paint the Marriage at Cana. There was the baptism of Christ. He incorporated the baptism of Christ into the Marriage at Cana, conflating the chronology of these events. And so we have here girls returning from a bathe on the right, which you may recognise as being outside the Odney Club. And in fact, the other day I walked down there and took a photo in exactly the same spot. And you can, the panes of the window are slightly different, and there's a little building just behind blocking that view now. But it is very much an actual location that you can retrace your steps to. And if anyone wants to recreate bathers at Odney, let me know. I'll come down and take a photo. And these, again, are a combination of a biblical event or a spin-off of a biblical event, because these are really just bystanders at the event, taking place in an actual Cookham location, but also layering in those memories from his childhood. And that's particularly the case with Sunbathers at Odney. And if I go back to that same letter that I quoted from earlier, to Desmond Chute in March 1917, when he's describing the morning, he describes his swimming at Odney in very spiritual terms. And he said in that, he said, "I feel awake and alive. That is the time for visitations. We swim and look at the bank over the rushes. I swim right in the pathway of sunlight. I go home to breakfast, thinking as I go of the beautiful wholeness of the day." So Odney, as a place to swim in the mornings, has these deeply spiritual connections to him. And so when he's painting sunbathers at Odney, it looks like it could be an everyday scene of other people. Then the next layer down is that it's actually people who've witnessed the baptism of Christ. And then the layer down below that is it's actually Spencer's memories from his childhood and his youth and the kind of spiritual feelings that he has associated with it. So his paintings are like a palimpsest in which meaning upon meaning is layered, and you have this blend of the spiritual and the everyday going on together. Now, I am drawing soon to a close, and I just want to kind of bring this back to landscape, because I said earlier on that I was going to complicate things about landscape, which is what I'm going to do now. So the view from Cookham Bridge is ostensibly a straightforward landscape. And again, actually, I went and I stood, I'm sure you're all very familiar with this view. You cannot recreate this view very well now because there's a massive willow tree that was not there in 1936. So it's very difficult. If the willow tree weren't there, you'd be able to get almost exactly the same view, but at the moment you're mostly just getting willow. So even though this is nominally a landscape painting that he could have made on the spot or worked up from a sketch taken on the spot, there is still a spiritual significance to this because Cookham was so imbued with these religious feelings and this deep love that he felt for the place. So I'm going to read another quote to you because really Spencer explains his own paintings better than anyone else can, and you need to hear his explanations, I think, often to hear what's going on. But here he's not talking about this painting, he's talking about the River Thames and the significance of the River Thames to him and of Cookham. So he said, "My Cookham feelings were really this, that I felt this Ascot fashion, Bolter's Lock, Sunday, bank holiday, terrific physical life could be tremendous seen spiritually. And this desire on my part was intensified by the fact that Cookham had, as far as nature aspects were concerned, and as far as the different jobs that were done there, boats and boat building, etc., an affinity with the Bible and the Bible atmosphere. So that in a way, all the things that happened at Cookham happened in the Bible." So it's almost like he sees the parallels physically and in terms of activities between Cookham and the Bible. But when he said this terrific physical life could be tremendous seen spiritually, he's referring to his feelings about everyday life translating into religious feelings. And that is really what he's trying to do here in his last great imaginative painting, Christ Preaching at Cookham Regatta, where he's bringing together all of these feelings. Now, I talked about Ascot Day, Bolter's Lock, and of course the regatta is another of these great river-based events, and it was the social event of the season. What he's painting here is not Cookham Regatta as it was in the 1950s when he was working on it, but as Cookham Regatta is in the early 1900s when he's a child and he's remembering it. And for him, it was this incredibly exciting time and day of celebration or weekend of celebration. And so everybody is in their party clothes. There are Chinese lanterns. There are the swells who were in the punts that Spencer and his family couldn't afford, which is why he is standing on the bridge, because he and his brother and sister would go and stand on the bridge to watch them because Mr. Turk inflated the prices of his punts so much during the regatta that the locals couldn't afford them. So characteristically, Cookham Regatta has become the Day of Judgment, but in Spencer's theology, the Day of Judgment is not actually a day of judgment. There's no sheep being separated from the goats here. It's a day of celebration where everybody gets the thing they most wanted or wished for. It's the day of ultimate fulfillment. And I discovered in a letter that he wrote in about 1957, 58, that this was actually one of two paintings that he had planned, a large one and an even larger one. And this is the smaller of the two. So this is the Berkshire Bank, and the other one was going to be the Buckinghamshire Bank. And it didn't get any further than drawings, but it's probably just as well, because we would need a bigger gallery had he done the other one. But even though it was never finished, and actually I'm quite pleased it's not finished, because I think it's a wonderful expose of his working techniques, this really is kind of the culmination, I think, of all of his feelings about Cookham, where he's taken a real identifiable location with real people, real events, but those from his memory, and then he has overlaid them with a biblical event, but underneath all of that really are his feelings of love and joy at being in Cookham. Thank you.